Hey guys, quick question. Have you ever daydreamed about a romantic fairy tale medieval wedding? You know, a castle courtyard bathed in candlelight, a graceful maiden in a flowing gown, a dashing knight pledging his love forevermore. Yeah, forget all that. Because if you actually had to live through a medieval wedding, you'd be praying for a quick plague outbreak just to get out of it. And by the end of today's video, you'll realize that those TikTok Renaissance Fair videos are nothing but a pack of sanitized lies. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Alright, it's time to attend a medieval wedding. Spoiler alert, you don't want to. Let's set the scene. You wake up in a cramped, flea-ridden hovel in some anonymous 13th century European village. The air reeks of livestock, sewage, and something you hope is stew. Through the cracked shutters, you hear the village crier bellowing the announcement, "A wedding is happening today." You'd be excited if this meant cake and dancing. It doesn't. In medieval times, weddings weren't about love, or romance, or personal choice. They were business transactions, livestock for a bride, a sack of grain for a cousin, strategic land mergers disguised as holy unions. If you happened to be the bride, your opinion was about as valuable as a lump of dirt, unless you were dirt with a dowry, in which case you were slightly more valuable dirt. And don't expect to save the date. Most medieval folks didn't even know their own birthdays, let alone plan anything months in advance. A wedding could be arranged and held in a matter of days, or hours. If your father struck a deal at the tavern last night while deep in his fourth goblet of violently sour mead, you might wake up single and go to bed married to a man twice your age, with 3 teeth and a cough that sounds suspiciously like death. Now, let's talk about the paperwork, or rather, the absolute lack of it. A medieval marriage was often as official as a handshake. In some regions, all you had to do was declare yourselves married in front of a few witnesses. Congratulations, you are bound for life. No officiant. No venue deposit, no pastel color scheme, just 2 people reluctantly mumbling oaths and hoping their parents don't make them seal it with a full-on mouth kiss, which, by the way, was considered public decency back then. If you were noble, you got a slightly fancier ordeal. Emphasis on slightly. Royal weddings were grand displays of wealth, alliances, and political chess moves. Love was not invited. Your father might promise you to a man you'd never met, because it would get him a better trade agreement with the neighboring duchy. It wasn't uncommon for noble girls to be betrothed at the tender age of 7 and married by 12, because why wait for puberty when you could lock down a political alliance while your daughter still thinks catching frogs is a career path? Of course, the church had some opinions about all this, and by opinions I mean oppressive, contradictory laws that changed depending on which power-hungry bishop was currently sitting on his jewel-encrusted chair. In the early medieval period, the church barely involved itself in peasant weddings. It wasn't until later that it decided marriage should be a sacrament. Before that, a lot of unions were forged under trees, in taverns, or quite literally in bed. Nutritional deficiencies are rampant. You'll develop conditions like pellagra, a horrifying disease caused by a lack of niacin that turns your skin to leather and makes you hallucinate jaguar gods coming for your soul. Protein? Rare. Fruit? No ceremony required. 1 minute you're fumbling around in the hayloft, the next your husband and wife and your respective fathers are arguing about the goat dowry before the sweat is dried. But if there was a formal ceremony, brace yourself. First of all, forget about white dresses. White fabric was for the rich, impractical, and plague immune. Most brides wore their best dress, which might be dark green, faded blue, or some shade of brown that matched the mud outside. Jewelry was rare unless you belonged to the 0.1% who weren't currently dying of dysentery. A bride might wear a crown of herbs or flowers, but good luck finding fresh flowers in the middle of February when half the village fields are frozen solid and the other half are being used as communal toilets. And then there's the blessing of the bedchamber. Oh, you didn't think medieval folks would let a newlywed couple consummate the marriage in private, did you? Silly modern romantic. In many noble households, witnesses, usually older, know-your relatives, would accompany the couple to the bedroom to make sure everything went as it legally should. Some noble families even held contests to see which house's groom would finish quickest. Privacy was a luxury for people who didn't owe rent to the local baron. Peasant weddings, meanwhile, were raucous affairs. Not because anyone was particularly thrilled about the couple, but because it was an excuse to drink until you forgot you lived in medieval Europe. Ale would be flowing, pigs would be roasting, and there'd be a fiddler who knew exactly one tune, which he would play for 9 hours straight until you'd rather tear out your own ears than hear it again. Games at weddings were less wholesome than modern equivalents. Forget tossing bouquets. In some regions, guests would try to steal the bride's shoes or garters, sometimes while she was still wearing them. One popular tradition involved forcibly removing the bride's stockings and flinging them over the guests' heads like a medieval game of dodgeball, except with far more groping and the constant risk of contracting lice. Speaking of lice, everybody had them. Lice, fleas, ticks, and assorted mystery skin conditions were the unsung guests of every medieval wedding. You couldn't swing a dead rat without hitting someone with scabies. And don't get any ideas about dancing the night away. Most people didn't know how to dance in any formal sense. They hopped, clapped, stomped, and occasionally fell over drunk. If you were lucky, nobody would fall into the communal soup cauldron. Let's talk about food. Modern weddings have buffets and vegan options and tiered cakes. Medieval weddings had bread, more bread, questionable meat, and something called pottage, a boiling cauldron of whatever the cook could find that day. Think turnips, old cabbage, bits of pig intestine, and sometimes a handful of herbs if someone remembered to rob the monastery garden. If you were wealthy, you might splurge on roasted swan, which tasted like a greasy, slightly fishy goose. But even that was a gamble, since medieval kitchens weren't exactly paragons of food safety. One spoiled dish could wipe out half your guest list by sunrise, which was sometimes considered a win if you didn't particularly like your in-laws. Drinks were mostly weak ale because the water would kill you faster than the plague, and the stronger stuff was saved for the upper crust. Mead, wine, and distilled spirits flowed in noble halls, leading to legendary wedding brawls and, on occasion, a guest getting so drunk they accidentally married the wrong person, which, surprisingly, was considered legally binding in some regions. Oops, you married the groom's uncle? Too bad, God witnessed it. Now, if you think modern weddings are stressful, imagine trying to get married while there's a war going on, which in medieval Europe there always was. Whether it was Vikings, neighboring lords, or the latest crusade du jour, the odds were good that someone was pillaging your wedding feast before the third toast. In fact, medieval chronicles are littered with accounts of weddings interrupted by battles, peasant revolts, or a bishop deciding halfway through that everyone was a heretic. And what about the bride's consent? Hilarious question. Consent was optional for women in medieval Europe, especially in marriage contracts. A father's word, a priest's nod, and a dowry exchange were enough. If a bride protested too loudly, she risked being declared unfit for marriage, which was social suicide, or worse, being sent to a nunnery, which was essentially life imprisonment with extra hymns. In fact, virginity was such a prized commodity that if a bride wasn't a virgin, her entire family's honor could be trashed overnight. Some families resorted to staging elaborate deceptions, fake blood-stained sheets, paid-off witnesses, or outright threats. If the husband discovered the truth, the consequences ranged from annulment to violent punishment, depending on his mood and how badly he needed that goat dowry. And let's not forget about the post-wedding activities. Forget honeymoons. Nobody in medieval Europe had the coin or clean roads for a leisurely holiday. Newlyweds typically spent the first days of their marriage hungover, scratching lice bites, and arguing over who had to clean out the pig pen. If you were a noblewoman, you might immediately be packed off to your husband's drafty stone keep, where your job was to produce an heir before you hit the advanced decrepit age of 20. There were no love letters, no romantic candlelit dinners. Love in medieval marriage was like clean drinking water, rare, unstable, and often riddled with bacteria. And this was considered a good wedding. Now, before you start feeling too bad for the medieval bride and groom, let's remember, most of them were barely clinging to life like half-drowned rats on a leaky ship. Marriage wasn't about happily ever after. It was about survival and property. And, if you were lucky, not dying of infected goat bite wounds before your second anniversary. Let's dig deeper into the charming customs of the time. Ever heard of a hand fasting? Sounds sweet, right? Like a folksy little engagement ritual. In reality, it was a glorified trial marriage. Two people would declare their intent to marry by literally tying their hands together, sometimes with strips of cloth, sometimes with animal intestines if you were particularly rustic. It could last for a year and a day, after which the couple would either make it official or pretend it never happened, kind of like medieval speed dating, only with a higher risk of plague. And speaking of plague, you couldn't plan a wedding without factoring in the odds of an unexpected community-wide Black Death-style disruption. Imagine sending out word to your uncle in the next village, only for him to die coughing up blood before RSVPing, or your betrothed getting carried off by a band of raiders 2 days before the big day. Not that it would cancel the wedding, you'd just swap in his brother or the nearest available widower. Now let's talk about the bride price. In many parts of medieval Europe, marrying off a daughter wasn't a sentimental affair. It was a business deal. The groom's family had to pay a sum of money, livestock, or goods to the bride's family, not out of generosity, but because women were considered an economic liability. Congratulations, your daughter's womb is now someone else's financial problem. The size of the bride price varied. A particularly fertile-looking maiden with sturdy childbearing hips might fetch a decent sum, while a sickly girl with a lazy eye and a limp might only be worth a chicken and half a sack of barley. And if you had no dowry at all, well, your options involve celibacy, a convent, or being the weird spinster with too many cats, assuming you weren't just outright accused of witchcraft by the first cranky neighbor with a grudge. The groom, meanwhile, might also provide a morning gift, which was a post-wedding present given to the bride. Think of it as medieval damage control. Sorry about the forced union, here's a goat. In noble households, it could be land, jewelry, or a small castle in the middle of nowhere with an ominous reputation for hauntings. Now, about wedding rings. The ancient Romans had used them, but by medieval times it wasn't a strict requirement. If you did get a ring, it was likely a crude band of iron or brass. Gold was for kings and corrupt abbots. And while today's rings symbolize eternal love, back then it mostly symbolized ownership, like branding cattle. And where did these weddings actually happen? Not always in churches. For centuries, most marriages took place outdoors, in front of the house, under a tree, next to a field, sometimes literally on a dung heap because no one felt like moving the livestock. The church only later muscled its way into the business of matrimony to collect fees and control who got to marry whom. Even when weddings did involve a priest, don't expect solemn vows and romantic blessings. Priests weren't required to be present until the 13th century. Before then, you might have a grizzled, half-drunk village elder grumble a few words and declare you hitched. And yes, if you were wealthy, a bishop might turn up. But only if you paid extra. And even then, he was probably hungover from the last wedding. And what about the infamous wedding night consummation ceremony? Oh yes, we're back to that. In noble households, consummation was a matter of state interest. It had to happen, and witnesses were sometimes required. There are documented cases of the bride and groom being put to bed by a crowd of onlookers, the curtains drawn, and an audience waiting just outside the chamber for audible confirmation of success. Imagine trying to perform while your great-uncle and half the court are eavesdropping. In one delightful example from medieval France, a bishop actually stood at the foot of the bed to bless the act itself. Nothing says romance like ecclesiastical supervision, and if you failed to consummate, the marriage could be annulled, which, given the circumstances, probably sounded like a relief. Now, let's pivot to another joyful aspect: fertility tests. A marriage wasn't considered truly legitimate until it produced a child. And since fertility was obviously the woman's problem, because medieval biology was basically a series of bad guesses and superstition, brides were constantly under pressure to conceive. If a noble bride failed to get pregnant within a year, she could be returned to her family like defective livestock. Peasant wives fared little better. Barren women were often suspected of witchcraft or blamed for crop failures. Got a bad harvest? Clearly it's Emma's cursed womb. Meanwhile, divorce was practically impossible. For the peasantry, marriage was until death, dismemberment, or a well-placed dagger. For the nobility, it was complicated but still rare. The church's stance was that marriage was indissoluble. If you hated your spouse, your options were limited to strategic poisoning, a fatal hunting accident, or a generous bribe to the nearest monastery for a convenient annulment. Even annulments required bizarre reasoning. You could claim your spouse was impotent, related to you, which half of Europe technically was, or that you'd been forced into the union under duress, which, let's be honest, was basically every medieval marriage ever. And about those inbreeding problems, yes, they were real. Royal families routinely married cousins, uncles, and half-siblings in pursuit of keeping land and power consolidated. By the 15th century, some noble houses resembled a genetic horror show. Crossed eyes, clubbed feet, and congenital madness weren't just punchlines. They were common wedding gifts from the family tree. Now, to lighten the mood, let's revisit wedding games. In some parts of medieval Europe, it was customary for the guests to forcibly undress the bride and steal her garter. In others, they'd try to wrestle the groom's shoes off his feet because reasons. And then there was the ritual bedding of the couple, where guests would throw the newlyweds into bed together while making ribald jokes and cheering like drunken livestock. And don't think the music made up for any of this. Medieval musicians were notoriously limited. Most could play exactly 3 songs, one for dancing, one for dirges, and one that sounded suspiciously like both. Instruments included fiddles, bagpipes, the kazoo of medieval Europe, and drums made from animal skins. If you got really lucky, a wandering minstrel might show up with a lute, provided he wasn't murdered for looking at someone's sister the wrong way. Now, food again, because medieval people ate like it was both their first and last meal. Wedding feasts, even among peasants, were a rare opportunity to consume meat, so they went feral. Entire pigs, boiled eels, baked hedgehogs, and pies filled with live birds, yes, really, were all on the menu at wealthier weddings. The famous 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie nursery rhyme? Not a joke. Wealthy lords literally stuffed live birds into pastries to startle guests when cut open. Congratulations, you now have pigeons flapping around the feast while your guests choke on greasy swan legs. And about those drinks. Ale was the safest beverage because medieval water was a bacterial soup. Mead, fermented honey wine, was popular at weddings and supposedly had aphrodisiac qualities. If you were noble, you drank wine imported from wherever your armies weren't currently fighting. Either way, everybody drank too much because that was the only way to tolerate the noise, lice, and in-laws. Now, let's get grim. The guest fatalities. It wasn't uncommon for weddings to end in death. A sword fight between rival families, a drunken brawl over an insult, or a bad batch of pottage could wipe out a good portion of the guest list. There are medieval records of entire wedding parties succumbing to food poisoning or collapsing into mass melees after someone accused the bride's uncle of witchcraft. And then, of course, there were wedding crashers. In medieval towns, news traveled fast. A feast meant free food and drink. Strangers would show up uninvited, sometimes armed, sometimes looking for a bride of their own, and occasionally with the express intent of robbing the place. Medieval wedding security was one angry cousin with a pitchfork and a dog named Bitey. To wrap up this charming part of the festivities, consider this. Medieval people didn't bathe regularly. The average peasant bathed once or twice a year. Nobles did slightly better, but only because they had servants to scrub them. Now imagine a packed feast hall filled with the unwashed, sweating, drunk bodies of 2 entire villages, plus livestock in the middle of summer. The smell could physically wound a person. And the best part? This wasn't a bad wedding. This was normal. This was the medieval equivalent of a dream ceremony. At this point in the medieval wedding, you might be thinking, well, surely it calms down after the feast, right? Maybe a nice moonlit stroll, or a lute serenade by a half-blind bard named Osric? Ah, no. Now comes the part of the evening where the combination of excessive drinking, suppressed generational trauma, and social repression transforms the remaining guests into a mob of howling degenerates. Let's talk about the bedding ceremony. By now, both the bride and groom are roughly 3 pints past rational thought, and the crowd is howling for blood, or at least the prospect of a consummation scandal. The newlyweds would be escorted, or sometimes physically dragged, to the bridal chamber. If you were noble, this might involve a room with an actual bed and cleanest sheets. If you were a peasant, it was more likely a pile of straw in a corner, behind a ragged curtain, and a single goat that refused to leave, and don't expect privacy. Guests would gather outside the room, loudly offering helpful advice and explicit encouragement, while chucking random objects and filthy jokes in through the window. It was considered good luck if a bawdy song or a crude limerick about rutting pigs was the last thing the couple heard before the deed. Romantic, isn't it? In some particularly deranged noble households, an official witness, or several, would be required to verify that the marriage was consummated properly. And yes, sometimes these witnesses were clergy. Imagine a bishop standing there with a goblet of wine, offering pointers like some hellish marital coach. But hey, maybe you're the kind of optimist who thinks, well, perhaps medieval weddings at least had nice traditions, sweet superstitions, meaningful little rituals passed down through generations. Sure, let's talk about those. One such tradition involved throwing wheat or barley over the bride and groom to symbolize fertility. Nice in theory, except that medieval wheat often came with extra protein in the form of weevils, and barley could be rock hard enough to bruise an eye socket. In some villages, it was considered lucky to pelt the couple with old boots or bits of bread crust. Nothing says lifelong happiness like being concussed by your cousin's shoe. Another tradition was the bride ale. This was a fundraising party where the bride brewed a special batch of ale before the wedding and sold it to guests at wildly inflated prices. Because what's more romantic than capitalizing on your impending marriage to fleece your neighbors for a few extra coins? The proceeds would go toward the couple's new household, or to bribe the local reeve not to arrest your drunk uncle for fighting the town pig. And the gifts? Forget matching towel sets or novelty waffle makers. Guests typically brought practical offerings: a side of bacon, a length of homespun cloth, a pair of sturdy boots, or a handful of coins. If you were rich, maybe a bolt of velvet or a silver spoon, which you'd better guard because someone's cousin would absolutely steal it before dessert. Now let's address the rampant superstition paranoia that clung to medieval weddings like a greasy second cousin. Practically everything was a potential omen. A dog howling during the ceremony? Bad luck. A pig crossing the path on the way to the church? Death within the year? The groom sneezing before the vows? Marital misery? The bride tripping? Probably a witch. Because obviously, a failed marriage wouldn't have anything to do with forcing two unrelated strangers together for political reasons at the age of 13. It was the pig's fault. Even the day of the week mattered. Wednesday was considered the luckiest day to marry for common folk, though nobles usually picked whatever date best coincided with a truce in the local war. Marrying during Lent was forbidden, though, as with most things medieval, you could get around this with a fat enough bribe to the bishop. Oh, and let's not forget the charivari. This was a nightmarish tradition in which villagers would gather outside the home of newlyweds, especially older men marrying young brides, widowers, or anyone suspected of having married inappropriately, and spend the night clanking pots, beating drums, and generally making enough noise to wake the dead. Sometimes it was meant as a joke, sometimes as a protest, and sometimes just because medieval people had literally nothing else to do at night besides die of rickets. Another bizarre tradition? The girdle removal. In some parts of medieval Europe, it was considered lucky for wedding guests to attempt to steal the bride's girdle, essentially her belt, before she made it to the wedding bed. This, as you can imagine, led to a lot of undignified scrambling, groping, and a high risk of being stabbed by someone's dagger. Consent was, of course, optional. And then there's the final grotesque flourish, the blood-stained sheet display. In many noble households after the consummation, the couple's bed linens would be examined for signs of the bride's lost virginity and displayed publicly the next morning. No pressure, ladies, if the sheet was clean. Scandal, annulments, and possibly exile to a nunnery, where you'd live out your days singing Gregorian chants and trying not to starve. Meanwhile, peasant communities might not bother with the sheet display, but would still spread gossip faster than a rat-borne disease if there was any suspicion of premarital activity. Medieval townsfolk loved nothing more than a good scandal to distract them from the fact that half their livestock was dead and the other half was plotting an escape. Let's briefly touch on bridesmaids and their original sinister purpose. Today, bridesmaids are your close friends in color-coordinated dresses pretending not to hate you for making them buy ugly shoes. In medieval times, bridesmaids dressed similarly to the bride not for aesthetic reasons but to confuse evil spirits. That's right. Medieval Europeans genuinely believed demonic entities lurked at weddings, hoping to kidnap or curse the bride. By surrounding her with decoy women, they hoped to throw off the spirit's aim. So your medieval bridesmaid wasn't there to fix your hair. She was an exorcistic decoy. And the best man? He wasn't just your slightly drunk cousin in a velvet doublet. His job was originally to literally stand guard. If any rival suitor, angry father, or opportunistic bandit tried to object, the best man would fend them off with a sword. In some cases, he'd even assist in kidnapping the bride if her family objected to the match. Medieval romance. It's basically organized crime in tunics. We should also discuss what passed for wedding attire. As noted earlier, white dresses were not a thing. Brides wore their nicest outfit, whether it was blue, green, or mud brown. Blue was especially popular, symbolizing purity before it was hijacked by toothpaste commercials. Veils were used not for fashion, but to protect the bride from evil spirits, curses, and jealous ex-lovers wielding turnips. Men wore their best tunic and hose, often dyed in whatever colors their local lord hadn't banned. Sumptuary laws dictated what materials and colors different classes could wear. You didn't want to get arrested at your own wedding feast because your sleeves were too long, or your cloak had forbidden embroidery, and for the love of God, do not wear green. In medieval superstition, green was associated with fairies, the dead, and promiscuity. A green-clad bride was believed to be inviting misfortune, illicit affairs, or abduction by malicious woodland spirits. Although frankly, after a medieval wedding, a life in the forest as a captive fairy concubine might have seemed like a step up. As for hair, unmarried women traditionally wore their hair loose, while married women covered it. A bride's hair would be meticulously combed, and possibly adorned with ribbons, herbs, or bits of metal, if you were particularly festive. At noble weddings, elaborate headdresses could tower dangerously overhead, held together with pins that doubled as makeshift weapons. Now for a final indignity, the running of the bride. In some regions, it was customary for the bride to be chased around the village by a mob of men after the ceremony. If caught, she might be carried off to the bridal chamber or doused with ale. Was this meant to symbolize fertility, ensure good fortune, or just give a bunch of drunk peasants something to do? Nobody's sure, but it made the Roman bachelor parties look restrained by comparison. And don't even think about ending the evening with a dignified toast. Medieval weddings often devolved into loud, chaotic free-for-alls. Drunken guests shouting rhyming insults, wrestling in the mud, occasionally torching each other's carts out of spite. The line between celebration and riot was thin and frequently crossed. But remember, to the medieval mind, all of this was entirely normal. Expected. Tradition. You didn't endure a lice-infested feast, be pelted with barley, get your hair yanked by a drunk neighbor, and listen to a priest bless your bedroom without it meaning something. It meant you'd survived yet another rite of passage in a world designed to kill you before 30. By now, our medieval wedding has devolved into what can only be described as a medieval hostage situation disguised as a celebration. Half the guests are drunk, a third are missing, and several more are unconscious in the mud. The fiddler has either passed out or been murdered for playing the same tune for 8 consecutive hours. And the pig you were planning to eat tomorrow has somehow joined the dancing. But wait, we're not done yet. The morning after a medieval wedding wasn't a quiet brunch with mimosas. It was a hungover exercise in damage control. Who died? Who eloped? Which cousin is missing a finger? Which dowry animal gave birth during the ceremony? The newlyweds were expected to rise early, no matter how violently hungover or psychologically scarred, and begin their new lives, which mostly involved chores. Peasant brides might find themselves ankle-deep in pig slop by sunrise, while grooms were expected to start tending to the fields or repairing the inevitable cart someone drunkenly crashed into the well the night before. Romance. For noble couples, things weren't much better. The newlyweds would often be separated immediately after the bedding ceremony because, in true medieval logic, the most important thing after getting married was to ride out and kill someone. Noblemen might leave for hunting parties, skirmishes, or sieges. Brides were typically locked away in drafty chambers with names like the Widow's Tower or the East Cold Room, where their job was to start growing an heir before the next rebellion. Meanwhile, the village would spend days cleaning up the wreckage of the wedding feast. Half-eaten pig heads, smashed pottery, broken benches, and the occasional unidentified severed ear. And of course, the gossip would begin. Medieval wedding gossip was its own dark art. Who passed out first? Who threw up on the altar? Did anyone spot a fairy or a demon lurking near the bridal chamber? Did the bride really faint when she saw the groom remove his hose? But gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was social currency. In tightly knit medieval villages where personal privacy was a mythical concept, your reputation could be destroyed by one bad wedding. If your ale was too weak, your feast too small, or your behavior too pious, you'd be talked about for months. Worse, your social standing might suffer. No one wanted to trade cabbages with a man whose wedding ran out of pig trotters before sunset. Then there were the inevitable feuds. Medieval weddings were notorious for rekindling ancient family disputes. Uncles who hadn't spoken in years would remember old grievances. Neighbors would accuse each other of cheating at barley toss. The town reeve might arrest half the groomsmen for unlicensed brawling. And if no one died, someone would accuse someone else of witchcraft to keep the evening interesting. If you thought modern weddings were expensive, medieval ones could bankrupt entire families. A nobleman might slaughter half his livestock to impress a neighboring lord. A peasant could spend his life savings on 2 barrels of weak ale and a piglet. In one recorded case, a medieval Englishman lost his entire farm paying for his daughter's wedding feast, only for her to run off with the local miller 2 weeks later. Happy endings were rare, but let's not forget the legal ramifications. A medieval marriage wasn't just a personal matter. It was a legal contract with far-reaching consequences. It determined inheritance, property rights, alliances, and legitimacy. If a marriage was challenged, say by a rival suitor claiming pre-contract, or a priest insisting he saw the groom in bed with a goat last Michaelmas, it could spark lawsuits, vendettas, and even small wars. Some noble marriages were arranged years before the bride and groom were even born. A particularly bold nobleman might betroth his unborn daughter to a neighboring lord's infant son, sealing the deal over a jug of mead and a handshake. If one party later tried to back out, it wasn't just a social slight. It could ignite open conflict. Even the church's involvement was a mess. By the 12th century, the church tried to standardize marriage, declaring it a sacrament requiring the couple's free consent. But since medieval parents heard free consent and interpreted it as, say yes or we'll drown you in the duck pond, its practical effect was minimal. Clerical courts were flooded with marriage disputes, women forced into unions claiming duress, men refusing to recognize children born of unofficial unions, disputes over whether a marriage counted if it was made while both parties were blackout, drunk on holy days. You think modern divorce court is ugly? Medieval canon law made Game of Thrones look like a children's cartoon. And then there was the matter of children, the primary reason anyone bothered with marriage at all. Producing a legitimate male heir was the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery. Failure to do so was grounds for annulment, scandal, or war. For noble women, life after marriage was a bleak treadmill of pregnancy, childbirth, and the constant threat of death from both. It wasn't unusual for a medieval noblewoman to bear 10 or more children, most of whom would die before adulthood. Childbirth was so dangerous that priests routinely performed last rites before labor began. Think about that. You get married at 12 to a man twice your age, spend your teenage years pregnant, and every time you go into labor, the priest shows up like the Grim Reaper's hype man. Peasant women fared no better. Married off young, they faced a future of endless pregnancies, back-breaking labor, and the grim knowledge that one infected splinter could end their life. And what if you refused to marry? Good luck. The options were a convent, living as a spinster under constant suspicion of witchcraft, or prostitution. Medieval society was built on marriage. An unmarried woman was a danger to public morality, to property law, and to livestock. Probably. But here's the darkest irony. Some people actually looked forward to this. In a world where famine, plague, and war lurked behind every corner, marriage represented a tiny sliver of social security. Even an arranged, loveless marriage meant more food, better shelter, and a fighting chance at survival. So yes, people endured the lice-ridden feasts, the blood-stained bed sheets, the supernatural superstitions, and the occasional murder because it beat freezing to death in a field. And that's the heart of medieval weddings. Not romance, not love, not even tradition, but survival. It was one more desperate gamble in a world designed to kill you young. A wedding was a transaction, a battlefield, a public spectacle, and a horror show, sometimes all in one evening. So the next time you complain about modern weddings, the overpriced centerpieces, the cringe first dances, the distant cousin who won't stop posting on Instagram, just remember that at least you didn't have to fend off goblin spirits, wrestle for your own girdle, or produce a blood-stained sheet to prove you were a good investment. And nobody tried to club you over the head with a turnip during the cake cutting. So, medieval weddings, a timeless reminder that no matter how bad family gatherings get, it could always be worse. Much, much worse. And that, my friends, is the end of this cheery little historical excursion. If you survived this medieval wedding journey, drop a comment and tell me your favorite cursed tradition, the blood sheet, the fiddle murder, the demonic bridesmaid theory, or just the entire concept of marriage as a livestock transaction. I'll be reading through them while downing a metaphorical goblet of medieval strength mead. Until next time, stay alive, stay sarcastic, and never agree to a hand fasting unless you're 100% sure you won't wake up married to your cousin. Hey guys, quick question for you. Have you ever fantasized about attending a medieval feast? A grand stone hall, roaring fires, glittering goblets, and lords and ladies toasting your health as a roast boar is wheeled out by servants in silk tunics? Well, you might want to rethink that fantasy, because if you actually stepped foot inside a real medieval banquet, chances are you'd be dead, drunk, diseased, or disemboweled before dessert. And yes, there was dessert. Kind of. Before you settle in, hit like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these cursed glimpses into history's most miserable moments. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining this worldwide club of morbid curiosity. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a questionable snack, and let's dive into what medieval banquets were really like. Spoiler, you wouldn't survive. Alright, picture this. It's the 14th century. You've somehow gotten yourself invited to a noble's feast. Maybe you're a knight fresh off a battlefield, a minor noble trying to suck up to your overlord, or a wandering bard whose only talents are storytelling and not dying of plague. Either way, tonight you'll witness one of the great institutions of medieval life, the banquet. Sounds glamorous, right? Wrong. First off, the stench. Oh, the stench. Medieval castles weren't known for their ventilation, and a feast meant cramming 100 unwashed bodies into a room lit by smoky torches and filled with the aroma of roasting meat, human sweat, spilled ale, livestock droppings, and that one guy, who still smells like the latrine trench he fell into earlier that week. And then, of course, you have the hygiene standards. Spoiler, there weren't any. Most guests hadn't bathed in weeks, if not months. The servants preparing your food, their hands were crusted with who knows what. There's a reason medieval recipes often called for so many spices. It wasn't for taste. It was to mask the smell of meat that was, by all reasonable standards, already decomposing. Now, let's talk seating arrangements. Don't expect to grab a cozy seat by the fire. Where you sat at a medieval banquet wasn't about who you liked, it was about your social rank. The lord of the manor and his favored guests sat at the high table raised on a platform where everyone could admire them and hope to avoid being executed for minor insults. The further down the hall you sat, the lower your status, until you hit the far end, where the servants, minstrels, and local freeloaders sat shoulder to shoulder in filth. Oh, and if you're a woman, your rank determined everything. Who you sat next to, how many courses you got, and whether you were forced to marry some old lord halfway through the evening because his third wife tragically died after drinking bad cider. Let's get to the food. Now, medieval people loved to brag about their banquets. Chroniclers would write breathless accounts of grand feasts with 300 dishes, 40 roast swans, and eels baked in almond milk. What those same chroniclers failed to mention was that most of this food would be either utterly inedible or designed purely for shock value. Your average medieval feast started with bread. Not fluffy dinner rolls, thick, hard slabs of stale bread known as trenchers. These weren't plates, but you used them like plates. You piled your food on top of the trencher, let the juices soak in, and then either ate it if you were starving or threw it to the dogs or beggars later. Congratulations, you've just shared tableware with a pack of disease-ridden strays. Then came the meat. Lots and lots of meat. Medieval banquets weren't for the faint of stomach. There were pigs, cows, deer, geese, ducks, peacocks, swans, and if you were particularly unlucky, porpoise. Yes, medieval Christians sometimes ate porpoise at feasts because the church, in its infinite wisdom, decided it counted as a fish for fasting days. Nothing says elegance like carving into an oily gray sea mammal by torchlight, and don't expect your meat to arrive looking like a nice roast. Medieval cooks loved to show off their grotesque sense of humor. They'd sew different animal parts together, a pig's head on a goose body, a chicken inside a rabbit, then roast the whole frankenbeast and serve it with a flourish. One infamous recipe involved stuffing a bird with another bird, then another, until you had something resembling an edible nesting doll of poultry. And yes, those fancy roasted peacocks were real. The skin and feathers were carefully removed before cooking, then reattached afterward, so it looked like a majestic living bird, but tasted like dry, greasy regret. Then you had jellies and custards, which sounds pleasant until you realize medieval jellies were made from animal gelatin, flavored with rosewater, and colored with anything from ground saffron to crushed insects. And as for desserts, picture spiced wine, almond pastries, and a thing called blancmange, a sort of rice pudding with chicken in it. Because in medieval cuisine, absolutely nothing was safe from chicken. Now, drinks. Water was a health hazard. If you drank it straight, you'd be dead of dysentery by dawn. So you had ale, mead, and wine. But medieval wine wasn't what you're imagining. It was sweet, syrupy, sometimes spoiled, and often so spiced that it tasted like a liquid cinnamon stick dunked in vinegar. Everyone drank heavily, not for fun, but for survival. The line between pleasantly tipsy and violently ill was crossed early and often. It wasn't uncommon for banquets to end with guests passed out in puddles of their own making, while others danced with livestock or attempted to fight the tapestry. And now, entertainment. Modern wedding DJs have nothing on medieval feast performers. You had minstrels, who sang ballads about knights getting disemboweled, jugglers who might hurl flaming daggers around in a room made entirely of wood and straw, tumblers and acrobats risking spinal injury for a stale trencher, and court jesters, whose job was to insult the guests so viciously that at least one noble would demand a duel before dessert. Sometimes noble lords hired trained bears to entertain the crowd, or even bear baiting contests held in the middle of the feast hall. Because what better way to digest a roast swan than by watching a chained animal fight for its life while a drunk minstrel sings about Arthurian incest? And for the truly elite banquets, the pièce de résistance, subtleties. These were elaborate edible sculptures made of sugar, almond paste, and food dye, shaped like castles, ships, saints, or sometimes naked women riding dragons. They were designed to shock, delight, and distract from the fact that half the guests were vomiting into the rushes. Ah yes, the rushes. Medieval dining halls didn't have floors in the modern sense. They were covered in rushes or straw, which conveniently soaked up spilled drinks, food scraps, and other bodily fluids. Every so often, a servant would scatter fresh herbs and flowers over the rushes to mask the stench. You haven't lived until you've tried to eat your pottage while ankle deep in fermenting animal hair and human filth. But it wasn't all fun and tapeworms. Feasts were political weapons. Every seat, every dish, every toast was a statement of loyalty or defiance. Sit too close to the Lord, and you'd be expected to fund his next campaign. Sit too far, and you might be accused of plotting treason. Decline a dish, and you insult the host. Accept too much, and you look greedy. And if you committed a social blunder, public shaming, or worse. One overambitious guest at a 13th century feast tried to cut a head in the meat line and was thrown into the moat for his trouble. Another offended a countess by burping too close to her wine cup and was found the next morning tied naked to a tree, covered in honey and ants, and we're still not done. There's more. Much, much more. So you've made it through the opening rounds of trenchers, peacock heads, porpoise blubber, and terrifying wine that tastes like regret and cloves. You've survived the bear baiting, the lute ballads about a duke who married his horse, and narrowly avoided being impaled by an airborne skewer hurled during a juggling act. Congratulations, you've reached the middle act of a medieval banquet, the turning point where things inevitably descend into chaos. At this stage, the combination of warm mead, cold pig grease, and medieval politics creates an environment not unlike a drunken, lice-infested powder keg. Factions start forming. Old rivalries bubble to the surface. Someone remembers that Sir Godfrey insulted Lady Matilda's mother 3 harvests ago, and suddenly there's a duel brewing in the corner of the hall next to a heap of discarded eel bones. Meanwhile, the food keeps coming. And yes, it somehow gets worse. You'd think by now people would be too full or too drunk to care, but no. This was medieval showboating. Hosts didn't just serve food, they weaponized it. The next course might include lamprey pie, a bloodthirsty parasitic fish boiled alive in spices and vinegar and baked into a pastry. Or maybe hedgehogs roasted on a spit and presented whole, quills and all. At one recorded royal feast, they served cooked beaver tails since the church, in its theological wisdom, declared beavers were more fish than beast because they swam. You might also be graced with jellied eels, presented cold and quivering like a gelatinous grave mistake, or perhaps a heron, a bird known for being chewy, oily, and tasting like wet rope, yet considered a delicacy because it was rare, and therefore expensive. Remember, if it's rare and gross, it's probably on the menu, and we haven't even reached the live animal section yet. You see, medieval hosts loved feast tricks. They adored spectacle, so they'd sometimes have pies served with live animals trapped inside. You'd cut into the pastry, expecting maybe a nice spiced pigeon, and instead, a dozen live sparrows would explode from the crust and start flapping around the hall, defecating on the guests and crashing into the torch sconces. Hilarity would ensue. Also third-degree burns. If you're lucky, you might witness the singing swan, a cooked swan stuffed with spices, posed elegantly, then made to sing, by sticking a bellows in its throat and squeezing. Nothing says medieval class like forcing a dead waterfowl to honk a funeral dirge, while everyone tries not to choke on bad eel jelly. And yes, everything you ate was shared by hand. Knives existed, but no one had forks. Forks were considered effeminate, heretical, or dangerously foreign in many places until well into the Renaissance. You scooped up pottage with chunks of stale bread, tore greasy meat apart with your fingers, and used your sleeve for a napkin. It was like an orgy of unsupervised toddlers, but with chainmail. Now, let's revisit the drinks, because by now everyone was well into the forget your dignity phase of medieval banqueting. Mead was guzzled by the gallon, ale sloshed everywhere. Wine, spiced thick, sometimes served warm, was passed around communal cups, ensuring everyone shared each other's diseases. One sip for you, one sip for Geoffrey, and one for Geoffrey's open weeping sore. Cheers. Drunkenness wasn't optional. In fact, getting blind, face down, incoherent drunk was considered a mark of good manners. The host's reputation depended on his guests being rendered functionally useless by the third course. To remain sober was an insult. To pass out face down in the rushes with a half-chewed pigeon leg clutched in your fist was practically a social triumph. And then came the toasts. Toasts weren't polite little speeches, they were war cries. Lords would rise, wobble on unsteady feet, and bellow extravagant oaths to the king, to their ancestors, to the Virgin Mary, to their favorite warhorse, and sometimes to a passing chicken. Guests would slam cups together and drink, spilling half of it down their tunics, and then it was time for more food. Always more food. Meanwhile, entertainment escalated. Maybe a group of mummers would burst in, wearing crude masks and staging a violent, nonsensical morality play about greed, death, and livestock theft. Or a half-mad storyteller would recount deeply disturbing fairy tales, inevitably involving cannibalism and unbaptized babies. Or a bear would be let in again, this time with a jester riding on its back while playing the hurdy-gurdy. For the elite banquets, it got even stranger. One documented feast at the court of Philip the Good in Burgundy involved a giant mechanical pastry castle wheeled into the hall, with live musicians hidden inside playing flutes made of bone. Another legendary banquet featured a roasted boar's head stuffed with live frogs, because someone in the kitchen hated God and joy, and if you thought the guests were well behaved, think again, fights broke out constantly. The mingling of drunk nobles, old grudges, and sharpened eating knives was a recipe for disaster. It wasn't uncommon for feast records to casually note how many men were wounded or killed. A medieval banquet without a stabbing was considered somewhat dull. One famous brawl during a 14th century feast resulted in 3 deaths, 2 blinding injuries, and a man being trampled by a runaway donkey. A good night by local standards. Even the clergy weren't immune. Monks invited to feasts frequently drank themselves into disgrace. One particularly famous medieval letter complains of a certain brother Aldred who, at the feast of St. Cuthbert, did vomit upon the bishop's hound and later attempted to fornicate with a shrub. Church history, everybody. And all the while, the feast hall itself decayed around them. Remember, these buildings were barely maintained. Torchlight blackened the walls. The rushes on the floor turned into a paste of spoiled food, blood, rat droppings, and bodily fluids. The air grew so thick with smoke and stench that guests occasionally fainted, only to be revived with a splash of cold ale or a slap from a roast duck. But perhaps the most impressive part of medieval feasting was how long it lasted. Banquets could go on for hours, or days. A single noble feast might stretch over 3 days, with dozens of courses, endless barrels of ale, and new batches of guests arriving as old ones died or collapsed. One royal wedding feast in the 15th century famously served 4,000 guests over 5 days, and by the end of it, half the town's livestock was gone. The streets were flooded with waste, and at least 12 people had drowned in wine vats. And don't even think about sleeping it off. Beds were limited. Most guests passed out at the table, on benches, in corners, or outside in the mud with the dogs. In the morning, the survivors would stumble upright, swat off the lice, and do it all again. Because in medieval Europe, a banquet wasn't just a meal, it was a trial, a performance, a war zone, a petri dish, a death sentence, and a status symbol. By now, if you've made it this far through a medieval banquet, you're probably wondering how anyone actually survived these things. And the short answer is, most of them didn't. Or at least, not with their dignity, internal organs, or reputation intact. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about medieval feasts. The food could absolutely kill you. Not because of poison, though to be fair, that happened too, but because medieval cuisine was a festering horror show of spoiled meat, unregulated kitchen practices, and seasoning meant less for flavor and more for disguising the smell of death. Let's start with the kitchens. The medieval feast kitchen was a circle of hell unto itself. Picture a giant smoke-filled stone chamber, crowded with sweating, soot-covered cooks wielding cleavers, skewers, and knives so dull they were legally classified as bludgeoning weapons. There were open fires everywhere, spits turning with entire animals skewered through them, bubbling cauldrons of mystery stew, and barrels of fish so rotten you could smell them from the next county. Hygiene was, at best, theoretical. The same hands gutting a boar would turn around and knead dough, then wipe sweat off their brow, then scratch a flea bite, then plunge those same fingers into the dessert custard. Rat infestations were inevitable. One chronicle casually notes that a cook's assistant did perish most violently upon falling into the pudding pot, unnoticed until the second serving. And speaking of food poisoning, medieval banquets were biological warfare. Spoiled poultry, undercooked pork riddled with parasites, shellfish served days past death, and milk products stored in wooden tubs crawling with bacteria. If you didn't get sick during the banquet, you were likely to spend the next week with a fever, convulsions, or bleeding gums. Yet somehow medieval people developed a masochistic fondness for these feasts, probably because in a world where daily survival meant dodging famine, plague, and bandit raids, a banquet was your one chance to die in style. Now, let's talk food-related hazards, because if food poisoning didn't get you, choking might. Remember, no forks. Everything's eaten with knives and fingers. Imagine trying to gracefully tear apart a greasy swan wing with your bare hands while drunk out of your mind. Bones everywhere, hot fat, random tendons. One slip, and you've inhaled a shard of peacock bone. Choking deaths were so common at banquets that it became a running joke among medieval chroniclers. One account of a 14th century feast describes a knight named Sir Ranulph, who perished upon a goblet of venison most grievously lodged in his throat, to the great merriment of those assembled. And even if you didn't choke, accidental injuries were inevitable. Between open hearths, spitting fire, swaying candelabras, and heavily armed drunk guests, burns, stabbings, and concussions happened at every major gathering. One famously disastrous banquet in the court of Charles VI of France in 1393 saw 4 noblemen burned alive when a dancer's torch ignited the straw rushes underfoot. The banquet continued anyway. Then there was the issue of dangerous table manners. Medieval etiquette manuals survive, and they are a testament to just how chaotic these events were. Some highlights: do not pick your teeth with your eating knife. Do not wipe your nose on the tablecloth unless absolutely necessary. Do not throw bones under the table where the dogs might fight over them and upset the guests. Do not drink so deeply from the communal wine cup that your beard leaves a greasy rim. Do not fall asleep face first in the trencher. Violating these rules wasn't just gross, it could get you thrown out, humiliated, or stabbed. And remember, the higher your rank, the more eyes were on you, judging your every move. But the greatest hazard of a medieval banquet was politics. Because this wasn't just a feast, it was a performance of power. The dishes served, the order of seating, the presence or absence of certain guests. Every detail was a deliberate message. A nobleman might pointedly serve his enemy a lesser cut of meat. A powerful lady might refuse a toast, igniting scandal. An ambitious knight might attempt to challenge a higher-ranking lord, to a drinking contest as a thinly veiled political maneuver. One wrong move and you could find yourself stripped of lands, imprisoned, or accused of heresy. There's a reason so many medieval coups started at banquets. Get your rivals drunk, isolate them in the hall, lock the doors, and let the bloodbath begin. The post-banquet aftermath was another nightmare altogether. After hours or days of eating, drinking, and public humiliation, the surviving guests would stagger away, leaving the hall looking like the aftermath of a battlefield. Trampled rushes, broken benches, pools of wine and bile, gnawed animal bones, the occasional unconscious minstrel. Servants would wade in at dawn to clean up what they could, often carting away the dead. And the guests? They'd stumble home or to nearby lodging, where they'd either sleep for 3 days, attempt to seduce a chambermaid, or die of food poisoning. It was medieval detox, and you didn't always make it out alive. If you were unlucky enough to be a servant at one of these banquets, your life was pure suffering. You worked for days in the sweltering kitchen hell, fetching barrels of wine, hauling carcasses, chasing escaped pigs, and dealing with nobles who believed stabbing the help was a valid form of customer feedback. Servants ate the scraps, literally the bits that fell from the Lord's trencher or were thrown on the floor, and even that was considered a perk. A good feast might mean actual meat, as opposed to your usual meal of cold pottage and sadness. Oh, and sometimes the Lord's dog outranked you. The noble's favorite hound was allowed to roam freely at the feast, occasionally climbing onto tables or attacking lesser guests. Woe betide the servant who tried to remove it. And then, to cap it off, there was the feast for the dead, because in true medieval fashion, some of the grandest banquets were funeral feasts. When a wealthy noble died, his heirs would throw a massive banquet in his honor, both to show off the family wealth and to cement new power structures. At these macabre parties, guests would eat and drink in the same hall where the corpse lay in state, sometimes seated at the high table, sometimes propped in a coffin by the hearth. Jokes would be made, songs would be sung, toasts offered to the deceased, and in one notorious case, the corpse's hand was passed around so guests could drink a toast by placing their goblet in its lifeless grip. Because why die quietly when you can become the centerpiece of a public food fight? At this point in our delightful medieval banquet, you're either dead, disgracefully drunk, or clinging to consciousness by sheer spite. But hold on, we haven't reached the grand finale yet, because no medieval feast was complete without one final act of culinary cruelty, social menace, and ritualized suffering before everyone either passed out or got dragged outside by a pitchfork. Enter the subtlety. If you think a subtlety was a polite little dessert, you're wrong. Subtleties were monstrous edible sculptures wheeled into the hall at the climax of the feast, a final unhinged flex of wealth and bad taste. And these things were insane. You might get a giant sugar castle filled with live doves, a life-size stag made of almond paste, a pastry ship crewed by stuffed quails. At one infamous banquet, a roasted boar's head was presented with fireworks stuffed in its mouth, which promptly ignited the rushes, a tapestry, and at least one unlucky noblewoman's hair. But subtleties weren't just showpieces. They carried political messages. A noble might commission a sugar sculpture of a chained lion being trampled by a boar, a not-so-subtle jab at his rivals. A king might order a giant almond paste knight beheading a marzipan priest, because medieval diplomacy was about as subtle as a battering ram. And yes, you were expected to eat them. Imagine hacking apart a grotesque sugar swan while drunk, half blind from torch smoke, and one bad turnip away from food poisoning. After the subtlety, the feast would drag into its nightmarish final hours. The alcohol would thin out, the meat would turn cold, and the guests would become increasingly unhinged. Drunken nobles would challenge each other to tests of manliness, chugging contests, knife throwing, impromptu wrestling matches, or attempting to out-insult the court jester. One legendary English feast ended when two barons decided to resolve a land dispute by seeing who could balance the most trencher scraps on his head before vomiting. And through it all, the hall got progressively filthier. By now, the rushes underfoot had become a morass of meat drippings, mud, bones, grease, spilled wine, dog hair, ashes, and what medieval chroniclers politely described as human issue. You didn't so much walk across a banquet hall as wade through it. And speaking of dogs, by this hour, the Lord's hounds had usually lost all sense of discipline, chasing scraps, mauling unattended trenchers, and occasionally attempting to mate with the tax collector's leg. Meanwhile, the minstrels kept playing, though by now it was less courtly ballads and more drunken war songs, lewd jokes about nuns, or improvised ditties about which noble looked most likely to vomit next. Sometimes a random trial by ordeal would break out. Guests might accuse each other of cheating at dice, insulting a lady's honor, or stealing a swan feather, and resolve the matter by wrestling in a pile of trampled goose bones. One 15th century banquet even ended with a full-blown trial by combat in the hall. Both combatants too drunk to stand upright, swinging dulled knives while the rest of the guests cheered them on. Now, you might think there'd be some form of graceful conclusion to all this. A speech, a toast, a religious blessing. Nope. The feast usually ended when one of three things happened. The Lord passed out. Once the host hit the floor or vomited into the high table's ceremonial goblet, the night was effectively over. A fight broke out so large it couldn't be ignored. Multiple casualties, tables overturned, hall set on fire. Time to call it a night. The hall physically collapsed. No, really. Poorly built feasting halls sometimes literally caved in under the weight of all those roast boars, overfed knights, and live animal subtleties. For those still standing, the aftermath was pure medieval despair. You had two options: sleep in the hall, curled up on a bench in a corner, or under the table next to the dogs. Stagger home, hoping you wouldn't be robbed, stabbed, or eaten by wolves on the way. The servants and scullions were left to scrape the congealed pig fat off the walls, carry out the unconscious, and throw the dead into the moat. And by dawn, the hall would already be preparing for the next one, because feasts weren't rare, occasional spectacles. In a world without Netflix, football, or Twitter fights, banquets were the medieval equivalent of social media drama, sporting event, and public execution rolled into one. And if you think peasants didn't party like this, think again. Peasant feasts were just as wild, though with fewer peacocks and more mud. You'd have a goat roasting on a spit, ale brewed in a cauldron the size of a bathtub, and 6 drunk villagers arguing about whether pigs could see ghosts. They'd eat whatever they could steal, snare, or scavenge: hedgehogs, blackbirds, and questionable root vegetables. Bread would be stale, beer would be flat, and dancing would last until someone fell in the fire. And yet, in a way, those humble gatherings probably had less death, less political backstabbing, and better odds of surviving the night than the grand feasts of kings and lords. Because in medieval Europe, a banquet wasn't just a meal. It was a public test of endurance, hierarchy, and sheer intestinal fortitude. A place where the wrong toast could get you exiled, the wrong dish could poison you, and a subtlety and poor taste might trigger a small war. And yet people still went, still toasted, still choked down jelly eels and rotten lamprey pies. Because as miserable as medieval life could be, a feast, even a filthy, dangerous, unhinged, borderline lethal one, was a rare chance to eat your fill, drink yourself stupid, and pretend for one blood-soaked evening that you weren't just one bad harvest away from starvation. So next time you complain about the cocktail shrimp at a wedding, or the dry chicken at a corporate dinner, remember, at least nobody tried to stuff your face into a dead swan and set your beard on fire for sport. And you didn't have to fight a bear. Hey guys, real quick before we begin, have you ever complained about hospital food, stiff waiting room chairs, or how your delivery room didn't have the right Spotify playlist? Well, buckle up, cause today we're diving headfirst into what childbirth was really like in medieval times. And let's just say you wouldn't survive it, or your baby, or your midwife. Honestly, the odds were bad for everyone involved. Alright, let's set the stage. You're a medieval woman, and congratulations, you're pregnant. Or rather, someone has decided you are. Because in a world where nobody understood ovulation, sperm, or how any of this actually worked, pregnancy diagnosis was less science and more educated guesswork mixed with superstition. Maybe you missed a few periods. Maybe you vomited after smelling bad fish. Maybe an old lady looked at you sideways and declared you with child. Either way, you're in for 9 months, or whatever random stretch of time people back then guessed pregnancy lasted, of medieval maternal horror. First off, prenatal care. Spoiler, there wasn't any. No ultrasounds, no prenatal vitamins, no heartbeat monitors. Instead, you got a handful of home remedies from your local wise woman, whose medical training consisted of folklore, herbs, and whatever she hallucinated during last week's ergot poisoning. She might tell you to avoid looking at ugly people, lest your baby turn out malformed, or advise tying an amulet made of donkey teeth around your neck to ward off evil spirits. And then there was the ever-present threat of bad humors. According to medieval medicine, your body was ruled by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If your humors got out of balance, you could miscarry, or worse, birth a baby with goat feet and a tail. The solution? Bloodletting, naturally. Or maybe a purgative made from crushed snails and stale beer. And good luck finding any reliable medical help, because physicians wouldn't touch you. Childbirth was women's business, and midwives handled it all. These were local women, often illiterate, sometimes accused of witchcraft, whose qualifications were basically survived a lot of births and has a steady hand with a bone saw. That's right, bone saw, but we'll get to that. As your pregnancy progresses, you start following medieval advice on how to ensure a healthy child. Eat almonds for intelligence. Avoid eels for fear of birthing something scaly. Don't sleep during a full moon. And absolutely do not, under any circumstances, attend a hanging lest the trauma mark your unborn child's soul. Unless you wanted to, of course. No one was consistent. Then there's the birth chamber. When the time came, you were confined to a hot, dark, smoky room filled with other women, herbs, and questionable icons. Men weren't allowed inside because their presence might anger the spirits, or the women, or both. The room would be sweltering because medieval superstition claimed warmth made labor easier. Fires roared, windows stayed shut, and the air was thick with sweat, smoke, and the unmistakable aroma of human suffering. Midwives would hang religious charms everywhere. Images of the Virgin Mary, bits of cloth blessed by a saint, and possibly a nail from a church door, because when your cervix refuses to cooperate, nothing soothes like a splintered holy relic. And let's talk about the position you'd give birth in. Forget your modern hospital bed. Medieval women squatted, knelt, leaned against walls, or used a birthing chair, a wooden torture device with a hole in the seat, no back, and 2 handles you clung to, like your life depended on it. Because it did. Now, the delivery itself. Pain relief options included ale, lots of it, prayers, hope those saints are listening, opium if you're rich and sinful, and if all else failed, biting down on a rag and screaming like a banshee. Midwives had their own rituals. Some would rub your belly with goose fat. Others would place an iron key or a holy book between your legs, hoping to unlock the birth canal. In times of real desperation, they might recite ancient spells or slap you across the face to shock the baby out. And if the labor stalled, well, now we're in nightmare territory. There were no cesarean sections for live mothers. If a baby got stuck, midwives resorted to medieval obstetric tools, hooks, sharp knives, and long metal tongs for manually extracting the child, or what remained of it. And if the mother died, which happened a lot, they might cut the baby out post-mortem, if only to save its soul through a quick baptism before death. Infant mortality was obscene. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of newborns died within a week, and those were the lucky ones. Many were stillborn, born deformed, or lived just long enough to catch medieval smallpox, and if the baby survived, guess what? Now you had to baptize it immediately, because unbaptized infants went straight to limbo. If a midwife suspected a dying newborn, she might improvise a baptism using beer or milk, because any fluid in a storm, right? The mother's odds weren't much better. Postpartum infection, known as childbed fever, killed thousands. No antiseptics, no sterilization. The same hands delivering your baby might have just gutted a chicken or handled a rat trap. Even worse, if a woman died in childbirth, it was often written off as God's will or punishment for Eve's original sin. Medieval theologians loved reminding women that their suffering was divine retribution for that one apple incident. And here's the kicker, no one ever stopped getting pregnant. Birth control was limited to desperate folk remedies, amulets, herbal concoctions, prayers, and the occasional medieval condom made from sheep intestines, none of which worked reliably. So unless you died young, and odds are you would, you were expected to produce as many heirs as your ruined pelvis could manage. That's the opening horror show, but trust me, it gets worse. Because medieval society wasn't content to just let childbirth kill you. There were social customs, religious laws, and deeply cursed superstitions about newborns, wet nurses, midwives, and what to do if your baby was born during an eclipse. So, you survived childbirth somehow, either by sheer luck, an aggressive midwife with the arm strength of a blacksmith, or the intervention of whichever saint you'd been screaming to, while clinging to a splintered birthing chair. Congratulations, but don't get too comfortable, because now you had to navigate the equally horrific, socially cursed postnatal customs of medieval Europe. First things first, the church demanded a public accounting of your womb. That's right, childbirth wasn't a private matter. It was a religious event, a public spectacle, and a potential spiritual scandal rolled into one. The baptism had to happen immediately, as in within minutes or hours at most. If the baby was looking even remotely sickly, and let's be honest, most medieval newborns resembled something halfway between a drowned vole and a bruised turnip, the midwife was expected to perform an emergency baptism, and in some places, it wasn't uncommon for her to improvise with any available liquid. Well water, ale, milk, rainwater, or in one legendary case, goat's milk straight from the source. Because dying unbaptized meant the baby's soul would be condemned to limbo, a sort of celestial waiting room where unbaptized infants spent eternity floating around, neither suffering nor rewarded, but forever denied heaven. Fun, right? And yes, this happened so often it became routine. Medieval churches kept special fonts just for infant corpses. Some cities even had baby cemeteries for the stillborn or limbo-bound, buried at the edge of town like unclean secrets. But if your baby survived, which was never a sure thing, next came the naming ritual. You didn't name the child before birth because that tempted fate. Babies were often called child, bairn, or it, until the priest splashed them with holy water and declared them worthy of a proper Christian name. And those names weren't exactly cheerful. Medieval parents loved names like Dolorosa, sorrowful, Perdita, lost, and Deodatus, given by God, usually because you'd already buried 6 others. Now, what about the mother? Well, you were considered spiritually unclean after giving birth. Not just sweaty and traumatized, but religiously polluted, which meant you couldn't attend church, take communion, or handle holy objects until you underwent a special cleansing ceremony known as churching. Churching happened about 40 days after delivery, if you lived that long. It involved the mother kneeling at the church doors while a priest recited prayers to purify her filthy, birth-tainted soul. Only then could you return to normal life, which again meant getting pregnant immediately because your husband hadn't looked at another woman in 6 weeks and was starting to vibrate. But let's back up, because in those 6 weeks between childbirth and churching, your life was complicated. For one thing, you weren't supposed to leave the house. Superstition claimed new mothers were vulnerable to evil spirits, demons, and witches. It was believed that malevolent forces would snatch your baby's soul, cause your milk to curdle, or swap your infant for a changeling, a grotesque fairy child or goblin left in its place. Signs your baby had been swapped for a changeling included: it wouldn't stop screaming, it refused to feed, it looked odd, which, let's face it, most newborns do. It suddenly grew teeth. If any of these happened, you were advised to beat the child, hold it over a fire, or leave it out in the woods to scare the fairies into returning the real baby. You know, loving maternal instincts. Meanwhile, breastfeeding was a matter of life and death, superstition, and financial status. If you were a poor woman, you nursed your child yourself, provided you produced milk, weren't ill, and hadn't been struck barren by an angry neighbor's curse. If you were wealthy, you immediately hired a wet nurse, because medieval medical theory believed breast milk carried moral and emotional qualities. Your baby might literally absorb your bad mood, laziness, or heresy through your milk. Better to outsource that hazard to a peasant woman with strong hips and questionable morals. Wet nurses were usually poor, desperate, and already lactating from their own recent childbirth. They were expected to feed your child, soothe it, and preferably love it a little less than their own. Some wet nurses lived in the household. Others took the baby away to raise it elsewhere, sometimes for years. And yes, wet nurse horror stories abound. A famous 14th century English case involved a wet nurse who, out of spite, smothered her charge because she was tired of the lady's demands. In France, some aristocratic families cycled through wet nurses like disposable napkins, blaming infant deaths on bad milk or unwholesome humors. Even when breastfeeding went well, medieval medical texts warned of alarming risks. If a mother became too lustful while nursing, her milk would sour and poison the child. If she ate garlic, drank wine, or heard blasphemy, the baby might suffer convulsions. Some believed a mother's bad dreams could pass through the milk and give the child nightmares. And just when you thought you could relax, no, Because medieval society had a limitless list of things that could go wrong in a baby's first year. Evil spirits, the evil eye, demonic possession, being born under a bad star. Astrologers made a fortune predicting infant fates based on birth charts. Being born during an eclipse was considered a curse, guaranteeing deformity or madness. If your baby seemed too quiet, it might be cursed. Too noisy, definitely cursed. Grew teeth early, a demon. Didn't grow teeth, another kind of demon. Mothers hung amulets around the child's neck. Wolf's teeth for strength, iron nails for protection, dried toad parts to ward off evil spirits. Cribs were surrounded by crosses, relics, and, in one particularly charming German tradition, a knife driven into the wooden frame to scare off witches, and if illness struck, good luck. Medieval infant medicine was a mix of prayer, herbal fumigation, and animal parts. Remedies for colic included smearing the baby's belly with fox fat or tying a dead mole around its neck. For teething, you rubbed the gums with hare's brain or dog's milk, and if the child had a fever, you might wave a burning bundle of sage over its head while reciting a psalm backwards. If nothing worked, which was most of the time, the baby was either buried quietly, if unbaptized, or with a full church service, if properly sanctified. Infant graveyards were common, especially after plague outbreaks, when child mortality skyrocketed, and through all this, no one blamed the fathers. Medieval society firmly believed everything that happened during pregnancy and childbirth was the woman's fault. If the child was ugly, she'd looked at the wrong animal. If it died, she'd had impure thoughts. If it grew up to be a criminal, well, her womb had been cursed from the start. Alright, so far, you've survived medieval pregnancy, a house full of smoke, superstitious women clutching holy relics, and possibly a half-baptized newborn, still screaming like a wet bat. But what if your labor didn't go according to plan? What if the baby got stuck? What if it turned sideways? What if it arrived with a claw hand and a bad attitude? Well then, my friend, welcome to the next level of medieval maternal horror, obstetrical intervention. Now, keep in mind that in medieval Europe, cesarean sections were not considered a thing you did to save a mother and child. C-sections were a last resort performed only after the mother was either dead or so far gone, no one expected her to survive. The idea was to at least try to save the baby's soul for baptism before both of you joined the great plague pit in the sky. And the procedure itself, it wasn't done in a clean room. It wasn't done with trained surgeons. It was done on a table or the floor, or wherever the poor woman finally collapsed. There were no sterilized knives, just whatever sharp thing was nearby. A kitchen cleaver, a woodworker's saw, maybe your neighbor's hunting dagger. The only anesthetic was prayer and screaming, and if you were fortunate, a large amount of ale. One 14th century record describes a midwife drawing forth the child from the dead woman's belly most violently, with such trembling as to be herself made sick in the act, which frankly sounds like a good night by medieval medical standards. If you managed to survive childbirth without needing emergency disembowelment, you still weren't in the clear. There was a horrifying list of post-birth complications medieval medicine was blissfully unequipped to handle. Hemorrhaging, no blood transfusions. The solution was to tie bits of sheep's wool to your thighs and pray. Uterine prolapse, that's when your internal organs decide to pack up and exit through your birth canal. Medieval midwives would shove everything back inside and plug you up with wool soaked in vinegar. Fever and infection, blame it on bad humors, of course. Prescribed treatments included bloodletting, hot poultices of mashed leeks, or binding a dead pigeon to your armpit to draw out the illness. And if the new mother started experiencing what we now recognize as postpartum depression, medieval society had zero sympathy. Women were warned not to show grief or melancholy after childbirth, or they risked being accused of witchcraft or moral failing. If a woman spoke of hearing voices, seeing shadows, or wishing her baby away, it was assumed demons had taken hold of her womb. Treatment involved forced fasting, exorcisms, and in some cases, literal beatings to drive out the spirits. Meanwhile, your husband would probably be back to his usual routine of hunting, drinking, and pestering the servants within hours. Medieval men were famously detached from the horrors of childbirth, seeing it as women's work unless a male heir was involved. Even then, his role consisted of pacing around the hall, complaining about the noise, and possibly swearing an oath to build a chapel if God spared the child. If the baby was a boy and survived the first week, congratulations. You'd fulfilled your medieval duty as a womb with legs. If it was a girl, well, better luck next time. Daughters were considered economic burdens until marriageable age, and were often ignored, left to wet nurses, or in the worst cases, abandoned. Now, let's not forget about the other medieval custom that makes modern people's skin crawl: the lying-in period. After childbirth, the mother was expected to remain indoors for at least 40 days in a ritual confinement period called lying in. On the surface, it sounds cozy, staying in bed, having servants tend to you, bonding with your child. In practice, it was another smoke-choked room filled with stale air, half-muttered prayers, and relatives offering unsolicited advice. Visitors weren't allowed, except for other women. The room would be sealed tight against evil spirits. Windows shuttered, herbs and garlic hung from the beams, holy water sprinkled liberally. The air would turn thick and suffocating. No one bathed. Hygiene was an afterthought, and the constant fear of infant death hung in the air like a wet wool blanket. During this time, midwives would continue feeding the mother herbal concoctions meant to cleanse her womb, some of which caused vomiting, diarrhea, and convulsions. The baby would be swaddled so tightly its limbs could barely move, the prevailing wisdom being that movement caused deformities. Some were wrapped for so long their bones grew crooked. If the child lived past the first month, it was considered a minor miracle, and heaven help you if another child was born too soon. Medieval society scorned women who became pregnant again before their churching period had ended. It was seen as evidence of lust, greed, and neglect. A woman once recorded as bearing 11 children in 12 years was declared a beast of appetite. Family planning? A joke. The best contraceptive was either chronic famine or a husband dead in a war. Now, here's where things get truly bleak. Infant death and medieval grief. You might imagine these people hardened to child loss, and to some extent they were, but mothers still grieved. Poems, church records, and letters survive, showing mothers naming lost babies, mourning them in private rituals, and leaving offerings at shrines. Officially, however, open displays of grief were discouraged. Excessive mourning was seen as blasphemous, as it implied criticism of God's will. Women were told to accept child death as a test of faith. Grieving mothers risked being accused of spiritual weakness, or worse, sorcery. Because if one woman's baby survived and another's didn't, medieval logic assumed witchcraft must be involved. And in one of history's darkest recurring patterns, some desperate mothers abandoned unwanted infants. Infanticide, while heavily punished when discovered, was shockingly common during famine years. Foundling hospitals and church-run orphanages overflowed with discarded babies, many of whom didn't survive long. All of this took place in a world where plague outbreaks could wipe out entire villages overnight. Pregnant women were considered particularly vulnerable, thought to emit vapors that attracted disease. Some towns banned pregnant women from public spaces during epidemics. Others prescribed burning aromatic herbs around expectant mothers, or forcing them to drink powdered emeralds, which worked about as well as it sounds. And yet, somehow, people kept having babies, because in medieval society, producing heirs wasn't just a personal choice, it was economic survival. More children meant more hands for labor, higher social status, and in some cases, the faint hope of one surviving long enough to bury you properly. And so, generation after generation, women braved the horrors of medieval childbirth, knowing full well what awaited them: pain, blood, risk of death, indifferent husbands, religious condemnation, and the constant threat of disease and misfortune. It wasn't bravery, it was inevitability. So, your baby made it through labor, through the unholy baptism by ale, through the risk of sudden changeling swap-outs, and past the childbed fever that tried its hardest to claim you both. Congratulations! You're now the proud owner of a medieval toddler, and if you think things get easier from here, you haven't been paying attention. Because in medieval Europe, infancy was basically a prolonged audition for death. Roughly 1 in 2 children died before the age of 5. Disease, accidents, famine, and neglect thinned out medieval nurseries like a scythe through wheat, and the world was basically designed to kill small children. Open hearths, boiling cauldrons, uncovered wells, rabid dogs, armed drunkards, no soap, no vaccinations, no clue, and the parenting strategies somehow both overbearing and wildly negligent at the same time. Let's start with swaddling. Medieval parents believed newborns' limbs were soft, malleable, and in danger of growing crooked if allowed to move freely. So babies were wrapped like tiny mummified sausages, arms pinned, legs straight, wrapped so tightly they could barely twitch. Some were left swaddled for days without being unwrapped, their parents checking occasionally to make sure they hadn't suffocated. One medieval manual advised that if a baby cried too much, the mother should strike it gently upon the head and place it in a quiet room with no light, which feels a lot less like childcare and a lot more like medieval hostage-taking. Now, nutrition. If you didn't have a wet nurse, or if she died, which happened often, you'd breastfeed for as long as possible because there was no formula, no reliable animal milk substitute, and no one trusted cow's milk unless it came out as cheese. Solid food was introduced late, usually stale bread soaked in ale, mashed beans, or, if you were lucky, gruel. Toddlers were fed whatever the household was eating. Fish bones, unwashed turnips, or day-old goose fat. Choking hazards? Absolutely everywhere. One record tells of a lord's son who died swallowing a pigeon's foot at age 3. And then there was the constant specter of plague and illness. Smallpox, measles, diphtheria, dysentery, plague. It was an all-you-can-die buffet for medieval kids. Medical care was a lottery of guesswork and superstition. A feverish toddler might be rubbed with warm pig's blood. One 14th century remedy for teething advised holding a dried wolf's paw over the child's mouth while reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. Another for night terrors involved placing a stone from a churchyard grave under the child's pillow. If a toddler developed a weird rash or started convulsing, it was either demonic possession or the evil eye. In either case, local options included bleeding them from the foot, binding a live frog to their stomach, forcibly baptizing them again, just in case the first time didn't stick, or abandoning them at a church doorstep and pretending it was someone else's problem. Meanwhile, safety precautions were non-existent. Babies crawled near open hearths. Toddlers played with knives. Pits, rivers, and cesspools claimed a shocking number of lives. One medieval chronicle casually mentions a noblewoman who lost 2 sons under the age of 5. One drowned in a wine vat, the other trampled by pigs. Superstition and paranoia ruled parenting. Certain days were thought cursed for children to be born, nursed, or allowed outside. It was believed a baby could die if a mother stepped over a threshold carrying the child on the wrong hip, or if a dog howled outside the window, or if someone spoke a curse under their breath in passing. If the child survived to around age 7, medieval society breathed a collective sigh of relief, because that's when you were finally considered a halfway functional human being, and not a minute sooner. At 7, children were often sent to work. If you were a peasant's child, that meant chasing geese, gathering firewood, or pulling weeds from dawn to dusk. If noble, you might be packed off to foster at another lord's estate, where your job was to stay alive, learn to ride a horse, and try not to get gored by a boar. Discipline was casual and brutal. The medieval parenting handbook had 2 settings, neglect and corporal punishment. One particularly cheerful 15th century manual suggests beating a child daily, lest he grow idle and disobedient. Another advised mothers not to show too much affection, lest the child become weak and effeminate. And for girls, life didn't promise much improvement. A girl was a commodity, an asset to be traded via marriage contracts before she even hit puberty. Fathers arranged betrothals for financial or political advantage, with girls married off as young as 12. Child brides were common, especially among nobility, where consolidating wealth and land took priority over anything resembling consent. And if a young bride became pregnant, which was dangerously frequent, she'd be thrown straight into the same medieval maternity meat grinder her mother had barely escaped. In short, the medieval cycle of childbirth misery was relentless. Pregnancy was a death sentence, birth was a gamble, infancy was a massacre, childhood was a minefield, and if you somehow made it to adulthood, you had plague, famine, and religious persecution waiting on the other side. And yet, medieval people persisted, not because they loved misery, though they did have a suspicious fondness for martyrdom, but because they had no other choice. Life was short, painful, unpredictable, and utterly indifferent to individual suffering. So the next time you hear someone complain about modern parenting, childbirth, or how tough kids have it today, feel free to remind them that at least their baby isn't swaddled like a damp log, warding off demons with dried frogs, or expected to marry at 12 while dodging pig hooves in an unwashed courtyard. Because whatever century you're living in, it could be worse. You could be giving birth in medieval Europe. Hey guys, before we get rolling, let me ask you a question. Have you ever complained about jury duty? Ever sighed about how slow court cases move today? Well, buckle up, because medieval trials made modern courtrooms look like a spa day. In the Middle Ages, you could be put on trial for crimes you didn't commit, laws no one understood, by people who were illiterate, drunk, or trying to sell your land to their cousin. And trust me, you would not survive it. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive into this waking nightmare together. So, what exactly was justice in the Middle Ages? Well, let's just say it was less Law and Order and more Monty Python meets Saw. Trials weren't about evidence, cross-examinations, or reasonable doubt. They were about protecting honor, keeping the nobility rich, and terrifying the population into obedience. And if a few innocent peasants had to hang to make that happen, well, medieval Europe wasn't big on apologies, the accusation. First, you didn't have to be caught doing anything wrong to be put on trial. Someone could simply accuse you, often anonymously. Did your neighbor's cow stop giving milk? Must be your fault. Did lightning strike the church steeple? The widow 2 doors down looked at it funny. Did someone steal a loaf of bread? Maybe it was that guy with the limp. Boom, you're going to court. Even animals weren't safe. Yes, in medieval Europe, animals could stand trial. Pigs, rats, cows, all legally prosecuted. In one infamous case, a sow was tried for murdering a child, found guilty, and publicly hanged while her piglets were sentenced to life in exile for complicity. You can't make this stuff up. The summons. If you were accused, a summons would arrive, usually shouted at you by a bailiff or nailed to your door. Literacy wasn't required. Half the time, neither was your presence. Some trials proceeded in absentia, especially if you'd skipped town, were hiding in a monastery, or had already been beaten unconscious by an angry mob. Refusing to appear didn't improve your odds. The court would simply declare you an outlaw, meaning anyone could legally rob, beat, or kill you with no consequences. Congratulations, you are now medieval Grand Theft Auto. The medieval courtrooms came in many forms. A lord's great hall, a church nave, a field under a sacred tree. The setting mattered less than who presided. In theory, it was a local magistrate or bishop. In practice, it could be whoever claimed authority that day. A baron's idiot nephew, a half-drunk priest, or the nearest guy who could read. The courtroom itself would be packed with people. The accused, witnesses, random villagers hoping for entertainment, and possibly a priest whose job was to keep God's name involved just enough to make the whole process feel legitimate. And medieval courts loved public humiliation. You weren't just tried, you were paraded around, shackled, jeered at, sometimes with a sign declaring your supposed crime. Did you steal bread? Expect to wear a loaf around your neck? Caught cheating? A donkey mask for you. The legal process. Now, don't imagine anything resembling modern law. Medieval legal systems were a bizarre patchwork of Roman law, church canon, feudal custom, and outright superstition. Judges consulted ancient scrolls, local gossip, and sometimes dreams or omens. One 12th century French court refused to rule until they saw how a candle flame flickered next to the defendant. Verdict rendered by fire hazard. Trials might open with oaths and ordeals. You'd swear you were innocent on holy relics, saints' bones, or, in one legendary case, a live beehive. The logic was that if you lied, God would smite you instantly. This almost never happened, but it made for great theater. If oaths failed, the court might turn to trial by ordeal. This wasn't punishment, it was the actual method of determining guilt, and it was glorious medieval nonsense. There was ordeal by water. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river. If you floated, it meant you'd rejected baptism and were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, and probably dead. Ordeal by fire. Hold a red-hot iron or walk across burning plowshares. If your burns healed cleanly after a few days, you were innocent. If they festered, guilty, which is impressive considering antibiotics were about 700 years away. Ordeal by combat. For serious accusations, particularly among nobles, the accuser and accused fought to the death. God would let the innocent man win, which worked out fine unless both died, in which case, well, double guilty. Witness testimony. You might think witnesses could save you. Nope. In medieval trials, witness testimony was often contradictory, unreliable, and wildly superstitious. It wasn't uncommon for villagers to claim they'd seen you turn into a wolf, consort with spirits, or make a pigeon fall out of the sky with a glare. And because the community knows best was medieval law's favorite excuse, the most unhinged claim could decide your fate. Character witnesses meant nothing if your family was dead or poor. In fact, being a widow, orphan, or foreigner basically made you guilty by default. The fewer people willing to vouch for you, the more proof you were up to something. Sentencing. And once your doom was sealed, the sentencing. Medieval punishments were creative, savage, and designed for maximum public trauma. Common sentences included fines for the rich, pay a sack of grain, a dozen pigs, or the rights to a mill. Whipping, usually in public, sometimes naked. Branding, hot irons to the face or hands. Nothing says repent like permanent disfigurement. Mutilation, cutting off ears, noses, hands, or feet. Hanging, standard issue for theft, murder, witchcraft, and bad luck. Burning, reserved for heresy, witchcraft, and crimes against authority. The stocks, humiliation station, locked by the ankles or wrists, while townsfolk pelted you with dung, rotten fish, and unsolicited opinions. And remember, this was for crimes like insulting the priest, stealing turnips, or witching a cow. And we haven't even reached the worst of it. The witch trials, inquisitions, animal executions, and noble vendetta courts. If you thought the regular court trials were bad, wait until you meet the special editions. Medieval Europe had a long and proud tradition of inventing new ways to legally ruin your life. We're talking witch trials, inquisitions, animal courts, and feud-driven noble courts where the rich executed each other like it was a hobby, and every single one of them made your odds of survival basically zero. Witch trials, the OG nightmare fuel. Let's start with the medieval equivalent of reality TV, witch trials. These were less about actual witchcraft and more about blaming random women, midwives, and occasionally the village eccentric for things like spoiled beer, bad weather, or your wife's infertility. Accusations often started with, "She looked at me funny," or "My goat limped after she passed by," and snowballed into full-blown panic. Once accused, there was no real way out. You could confess and be burned alive, deny it and be tortured until you confessed, or try trial by ordeal, which, as we've established, was medieval code for slow public execution dressed up as religious drama. Popular tests for witches included dunking, tied up and dropped into a river. If you floated, you were a witch. If you drowned, congratulations, innocent. Needle test. A witch finder would stab you with a needle or bodkin to find a devil's mark, a mole, scar, or freckle that didn't bleed or hurt. Everyone had one. Prayer test. Asked to recite the Lord's Prayer. Stumble once, hesitate, or mispronounce a word, straight to the stake. And let's not forget spectral evidence. People claiming you appeared in their dreams or visions to torment them. It was considered perfectly valid testimony. I dreamt you turned into a giant crow and stole my soup. Could and did send people to execution. Inquisitions, God's bureaucratic torture club. The Inquisition took legal absurdity to professional levels, originally designed to root out heretics, people who had the gall to believe slightly different religious nonsense than the Pope-approved kind. Inquisitions became an all-purpose tool for crushing dissent, land grabs, and general terror. Inquisitors traveled from town to town holding mass confessions. Entire villages would be summoned to confess sins, name heretics, and accuse each other of the usual. Sorcery, blasphemy, goat-related crimes. Refusal to confess was proof of guilt. Torture wasn't technically supposed to draw confessions, but was conveniently used to encourage reflection. Devices included the rack, stretching you until your joints popped like medieval bubble wrap. Thumb screws, self-explanatory. The heretic's fork, a metal rod with sharp prongs strapped between your chin and chest, preventing movement. The pear of anguish, a metal device inserted into the mouth or other orifices, then expanded. You get the idea. Victims were often promised mercy in exchange for a confession. That mercy typically involved being strangled before burning, rather than alive. Blessings. Animal trials, because why not now? For one of medieval history's most unintentionally hilarious chapters, animal trials. Yes, animals could be charged, tried, and executed for crimes against humanity. Examples include a rooster in Basel accused of laying an egg, considered witchcraft, burned at the stake. A group of rats in France summoned to court for eating crops. They were assigned a defense lawyer who argued his clients failed to appear because the roads were unsafe. The trial was postponed. A pig in 1386 charged with murder after mauling a child. The pig was dressed in human clothes, tried in court, found guilty, and hanged in the town square. These trials weren't jokes. They were serious legal proceedings with documented verdicts, witnesses, and sentencing. Feudal justice, the rich kill each other. While peasants suffered through ordeal by boiling water, nobles handled disputes via private courts and dual combat. If a baron's cousin insulted his hunting dog, or a rival knight stole a castle chicken, blood was going to be spilled. Cases rarely involved evidence. Instead, witnesses were bribed, the accused were pressured, and God's judgment was expected to settle it in combat. If a nobleman lost, his family might still appeal to the king for a pardon, which could be purchased naturally. One record from 1320 details a trial where both combatants died. The court ruled them both guilty posthumously and fined their widows, because why waste a good tragedy without squeezing some cash out of it? Punishments for the unlucky. For those not rich enough to duel or flee the country, punishments ranged from brutal to creatively degrading. Some personal favorites: the ducking stool for gossiping women, tied to a chair and dunked repeatedly in a river; the scold's bridle, an iron muzzle to silence women accused of nagging or speaking out; the pillory, locking people's heads and hands in stocks while the town pelted them with offal, spoiled milk, and insults; the drunkard's cloak, a barrel worn like a tunic for public shaming of drunkards. Execution methods weren't exactly swift or merciful either. Hanging was for peasants, beheading was for nobles, if you were important enough for a clean death; burning at the stake for heretics, witches, and other threats to the moral order; quartering for traitors; hanged until half dead, disemboweled, then cut into 4 pieces and scattered around the countryside as a warning. And yet, as unthinkable as all this was, people still packed the town square to watch. Because in medieval Europe, nothing said community bonding like watching your neighbor's head roll into the cabbage cart. And just when you think it can't get any worse, wait till you hear how entire towns were punished together for harboring a fugitive or letting a thief escape. And trust me, you'll want to hear what trial by cheese was too. If you thought the witch trials, inquisitions, and pig executions were peak medieval absurdity, oh, you sweet summer child, we haven't even scratched the surface. Because medieval Europe had an endless appetite for communal punishment, bizarre rituals, and legal customs so ridiculous they make trial by ordeal look like due process. Collective punishment, the whole village pays. In medieval law, guilt was contagious. If one person in your town committed a crime, everyone else was partially to blame for not preventing it. This is why medieval towns operated like paranoid, gossipy surveillance states. If a thief escaped justice, the entire town might be fined. If a murderer wasn't caught, neighboring villages could be punished for harboring the wicked. In England, the tithing system made every 10 households collectively responsible for each other's crimes. If one guy stole a chicken and skipped town, the other 9 men in his tithing had to pay up or find him, or risk a beating themselves. And God help you if a king's officer was murdered on your land. Entire communities could be burned to the ground in retaliation. In 1190, the town of York was fined nearly £300, an impossible sum, after a mob murdered some royal tax collectors, a debt many residents likely paid with their lives. The bizarre rituals of proof. Without forensic evidence, medieval courts relied on tests to determine innocence or guilt, and some of them, well, even by medieval standards, they were aggressively stupid. One favorite was the trial by cheese. Yes, cheese. The accused would be fed a chunk of dry, hard cheese and bread while under oath. If he choked, turned pale, or showed fear, it was a sign of guilt. If he swallowed it down without flinching, clearly innocent. How this worked when literally everyone in medieval Europe had bad teeth, I don't know. Then there was trial by cross. 2 men accused of the same crime would stand facing each other with their arms stretched out in the shape of a cross. The first one to drop his arms lost. Sometimes these contests lasted hours, No one ever said medieval justice was efficient. The king's mercy, or lack thereof. If convicted, a peasant could appeal for the king's mercy, assuming you had enough money to bribe a clerk, or a relative willing to walk 100 miles with a letter. The crown made a tidy profit by offering get out of gallows free passes to anyone rich enough to afford them. Not surprisingly, most peasants were left swinging. Crimes against the church, offend the church, and you were in for something extra nasty. Crimes like blasphemy, heresy, or defiling holy relics were handled by ecclesiastical courts, where punishments had a special flavor of holy sadism. A common sentence was excommunication, cutting you off from the church and society. No one could speak to you, feed you, or offer shelter. Worse, if you died excommunicated, you couldn't be buried on sacred ground. Your corpse would rot outside the church walls, and your soul was believed to be devoured by demons. For lesser sins, you might be sentenced to public penance. This meant walking barefoot through the streets in a sackcloth robe, carrying a candle the size of a child, shouting your sins aloud to every passerby, paying fines in grain, livestock, or sometimes jars of urine. Don't ask. And if you insulted a priest, you might have to crawl on your hands and knees to the church altar, beg forgiveness, and donate a hefty sum to rebuild whatever stone gargoyle was apparently weeping over your bad behavior. The curse of the relic oath. Another medieval legal gem was the relic oath. Swearing on a Bible wasn't dramatic enough. You'd swear your innocence on a relic, a saint's bone, a splinter of the true cross, or a scrap of some martyr's hair shirt. The weirder the relic, the more reliable the oath. One documented case involved a man swearing on the petrified tongue of St. Columba. If you're wondering how someone preserved a petrified tongue, congratulations, you're thinking too hard. If the accused was lying, it was believed the relic would either strike him dead on the spot or curse his crops. Neither of these things happened, obviously, but medieval crowds loved the theater. And if you think that's the end of it, wait until part 4, where we uncover public executions so demented that they make modern horror movies look like bedtime stories, and find out how entire rivers, cats, and inanimate objects got prosecuted. You don't want to miss that. By now, you've survived being falsely accused, flung into a river, force-fed dry cheese, stared down your neighbor in a cross-armed endurance contest, and possibly watched a pig get hanged for sorcery. But trust me, the worst was saved for last, because medieval punishments didn't end with a guilty verdict. Oh no, they turned public execution into a form of state-sponsored dinner theater. Public executions, the original reality TV, medieval Europe loved a good execution. It wasn't just about justice, it was about making an example out of you, traumatizing your neighbors, and turning a good hanging into a community event. People packed the town square hours in advance like it was a football match. Merchants sold pies and cider, local musicians performed, children clambered onto wagons for a better view. This was entertainment, and the gorier, the better. Execution methods ranged from the merely awful to the aggressively nightmarish. Hanging, the classic. If you were lucky, your neck snapped clean. If not, you dangled and strangled while the crowd jeered. Beheading. Reserved for nobles or really expensive criminals. An executioner's aim was hit or miss. Some required 5 or 6 swings. Mary, Queen of Scots' execution in 1587, took 3 chops and a panic decapitation by dagger, burning at the stake. Favored for heretics and witches, often delayed while clerics preached repentance to a sobbing, terrified prisoner tied to a post, drawing and quartering, England's go-to punishment for treason. The condemned was hanged until half dead, disemboweled, castrated, beheaded, and chopped into quarters. The bits were boiled in tar and hung from city gates. Boiling alive. Yes, this happened, especially for poisoners. You were dropped feet first into a cauldron of oil, water, or lead, in theory to deter crime, in practice to amuse onlookers. The moral pageantry executions came with rituals. Before dying, you'd confess, pray, or deliver a good death speech, expected to humbly accept your fate. Refuse, and the crowd might stone you on the way to the gallows. Heads of important traitors were mounted on spikes above gates. The smell attracted crows, which the townsfolk treated as a helpful cleanup crew. London Bridge alone displayed dozens of heads at any given time. Deadly fines and public shaming. Not every punishment was fatal. Fines bankrupted entire families. You could lose your livestock, land, or freedom for crimes like poaching or insulting a lord's hat. Public shaming was a medieval favorite. The stocks, pillory, and ducking stool let townsfolk vent frustrations. People pelted you with rotten food, mud, dead animals, or feces. Some villages held contests to see who could land the biggest hit. Women faced special humiliations. Accused of gossip or nagging, you got the scold's bridle, an iron mask with a spiked bit that stabbed your tongue if you tried to speak. Ward in public while the town mocked you. Execution of inanimate objects in rivers. Yes, it gets weirder. Entire inanimate objects were tried and sentenced. A bell in France was hanged for killing a man when it fell. A church door in Normandy was excommunicated for letting heretics flee. Even rivers stood trial. If a river flooded and drowned villagers, it might be blessed, cursed, or banished from its course. Not sure how they enforced that one. And let's not forget cats. In certain towns, black cats were burned en masse during religious festivals as agents of the devil, and sometimes the townsfolk just felt like it. Legal appeals were a joke. You might be thinking, surely there was an appeals process. Technically, yes, but good luck. Appeals were slow, required money and influential connections, and often reached higher courts long after you were dead. If you were lucky, your family might get a posthumous pardon, which, medieval Europe being what it was, they had to pay for. How it all ended. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, some of these punishments began to fade as courts standardized procedures. But plenty of these horrors survived well into the early modern era. And while modern justice systems aren't perfect, at least trial by boiling lead is off the table. No one's making you swear innocence on a chicken bone or strangle yourself in a sackcloth robe. Your odds of surviving a petty theft charge no longer hinge on your ability to eat a dry cheese cube without choking. Final thoughts. Medieval court trials were a disaster from start to finish. An unpredictable, brutal, deeply superstitious mess designed not to deliver justice but to maintain power, humiliate dissenters, and give the masses something messy to watch after market day. So the next time you get a jury duty summons, or roll your eyes at the phrase due process, remember, you could be standing in a 14th century pig trial, hoping the river doesn't decide you're guilty. And on that note, sleep tight.